were in any other school and had to do a project with regard to the history of the school, it would be very simple and very straightforward. The school wouldn't be that old for a start, and nothing very much would have happened. It's a school. I mean, what happens in school? People go to school, 1 year follows another, people graduate, it's all very boring. That's not the case with this school. With this school, you have 718 years to deal with. And that's not something you can say for any other school in the country. In fact, even if you broaden it and go to Britain, Wales and Scotland and England, I doubt if you could say you have 718 years to work with. So this school, in terms of its history, is extraordinary and it's unique. There is no other school in the country like it. And so that's why you have a problem. You have to do some kind of artwork, some kind of mural, and in that one picture you have to encapsulate the history of this place, 718 years. I'm not sure how you can do that. But anyway, you might get some ideas when I have finished talking. The easiest way you can deal with 718 years, of course, is to break it down. So you can break it down into three. From 1300 to 1540, then there's a gap, 1640 to 1922, there's another gap, 1940 to the present. So kind of three periods when something was happening on this site. And it is quite extraordinary to think that where we are, where the school is, the fields around it, have never been in private ownership. Unlike the rest of the town, which of course is entirely in private ownership. 1300 is our start date, more or less. We don't really have terribly clear evidence. We do have evidence. 1192 is the date for the town. If you want a birthday for the town, it's 1192. Oddly, in 1992, you'd have thought there would have been some celebration to mark the event, but of course it passed unnoticed. I suppose nobody realised that 1192 was when it all began. And if you look at, I mean, you all know the town more or less. Some of you are from the town, some of you outside the town, but you must have some relationship to the town. If you think back, what is it 700 years ago was exactly the same as it is now? Well, obviously, the Galties were there, Shlevenamuk was there, the Ara was there, the hills were there. All that's exactly the same. What was there but is now gone is there was a lake there. If you go from the monastery school down to St. Ailbe's, what's that road called? The Lake Road. Most people never stop to think, well, you know, it's the Lake Road, but where the hell is the lake? Well, the lake was kind of to the left as you're facing down towards Ailbe's, but it's long gone. But it was a very sizable lake. And on that side of the lake here, in the hills, there was a fortification. Do you know, as you go past Rosanna Tennis Club and you come to a fork in the road, and if you're going out towards Kingswell, there's a building there which used to be a cash and carry, and which is now kind of just left there on your left-hand side. Well, just to the back of that there was a Norman fort. So that was the fortification which began the town in 1192. And it was situated there because it was high ground. If you're above the monastery, you're coming down to the abbey and you're on a bicycle, what happens? You don't have to pedal, is what happens, because you're going downhill. Because very oddly, the town is built on the side of a hill, which is very peculiar if you stop to think of it. Most towns are built on flat surfaces. This town is on the side of a hill. And so, there's the river. The town is built like that. That's the main street. So why is that street the main street and not that one? Because that's the street that brings you from somewhere interesting, Clonmel, Waterford, to somewhere interesting, which is Limerick. That brings you from the Glen, which nobody knew anything about, up to Dunovan, which nobody knew anything about, so very uninteresting. So that developed as the main street. So 1300, the people in the town, and it's probably not correct to think of it as a town, it was just a settlement, a few houses. It's a village. But they decide that they need to have a religious foundation. So they get the Augustinians to come here. And so they find that they set up their abbey, and they put it, there's the river, so they put it here, on this side of the river. The town then develops on the sloping land on the other side of the river, but develops very, very slowly. The truth is, no abbey, no Tipperary town. It's as simple as that. If you have no abbey, you have no Tipperary town. Can you say that about any other school in the country? No Rockwell, no, take any school in any town. It's not an equation you can make. I mean, you know, think of a school in Dublin. Blackrock, no Dublin. You can't say that, it doesn't make any sense. But you can say it with regard to the Abbey in Tipperary. And so if you're looking at that first period, we don't really know much about the Augustinians being here, except for the fact that they were here for that 200 and whatever it is, 40 years. They kept the settlement of some kind here. If they weren't here, Tipperary town wouldn't be here. Maybe a settlement would have developed. If a settlement hadn't developed here, the place where it would most likely have developed is out in Golden. Because beside Golden, anyone here from Golden, that area? Beside Golden you have a castle, which was a much bigger religious foundation than the one here. And you had enough settlement beside the castle foundation that you had a kind of a little town, but it didn't develop. And they also had the advantage of being on a river, because a castle is on the shore. Whereas we're not even on the shore. If you think most of the towns in Tipperary, Carrick and Clonmel, Thurles, Cahir, they're all on the shore, which is why they developed. We're not on the shore, we're just on a miserable little tributary of the shore. Whereas the castle is on the shore, it had that advantage. So if the Abbey hadn't been here, it was probably the significant town in the region would have developed, probably would have been a castle. The Augustinians remained here until 1540. And then in 1540, as whatever history you know, or whatever you've seen on television, Henry VIII and his 6 wives, all of that stuff, Anne Boleyn, he decided to get rid of all the monastic and religious houses in both Britain and in Ireland. So the religious house here, the Abbey, was closed down. We know the name of the last chap who was in charge. He was a man called Dermot O'Quirk, and that's a very local name from the Glen of Ireland, so he was probably local. So he was given a pension and sent on his way, and the buildings simply were closed down. And the small amount of land that was attached to the Abbey was kept by the state, but rented. And it won't come as any surprise that the person to whom, and the family to whom it was rented, what's the dominant family name in Tipperary? Ryan, of course. So the family to whom all that, the land that was here and the bit what was left of the buildings, was rented to a Ryan family from Solhead. And I assume there must be some Ryans in the room. Are there? Is it possible that there's a group of people in the classroom in Tipperary and no one is a Ryan? Okay, that's very, very surprising. But the Ryan family was obviously they were rich enough to be able to afford to rent the place. They never owned it, they just rented it. And so that gap I've talked about, the Ryans basically had the buildings here. They probably took some of the stonework for other buildings. I mean, that's what happened. The only bit of the Abbey that survived was the arch, which you may have seen photographs of. It was in the field in front of the school. As you're standing looking at the school, somewhat to the left of this present school building. And I don't know if you've seen photographs, but maybe you will. Somebody will show you the photographs of the arch. Quite a high arch. But it was demolished in 1958, which is relatively recently, so it lasted a long time. All the people who came between 1300, 1540, all the subsequent people who owned the place, none of them knocked down the arch. It took the Christian Brothers to come and knock down the arch, which is something, again, I'll come back to later. But that was the last surviving piece of evidence, which is why when you're coming in, I'll call it the LNN way in here, you know, the Super Valley, you know the reproduction of the arch that was, you have noticed that, yes? Yeah. And you know why that was put there. It was put there, well, the previous principal was probably responsible, just to kind of commemorate the fact that this was a religious foundation, and that's why it was called the Abbey, and the Augustinians were here until 1540. Now the very odd thing about, as I say, this place was destroyed as a religious foundation in 1540, but the Augustinians remained in Tipperary, living in private houses. And they remained in Tipperary until, which again, if you think of the distance in time, is very remarkable. They remained here until 1847, which is several hundred years, doing the work that they'd always been doing, except of course they were no longer in the Abbey. And the next time you're up in looking anywhere near St. Michael's Church, you know as you're going into St. Michael's Church, there are burials on the right-hand side. Somebody nod that you know what I'm talking about. You know where St. Michael's Church is? And you're going into it, on the right-hand side, there's a little gate that you open and you go in and there are burials. And right down at the absolute corner, down here at the corner, there are 3 or 4 what are called table tombs. Called that for obvious reasons, they look like tables. People sometimes think that the bodies are kind of under the table, but the bodies are in the ground, which is where bodies are normally buried. Except that rather than having a conventional kind of tomb marker, you just have this structure that looks like a table. Well, the one that's second from the corner, first one is there, the one that's just there, the second one from the corner, is that last Augustinian who died in 1847 that was here. And he was buried here, he wasn't taken anywhere else to be buried. His colleague, who probably was the actual last one to be here, because he was here the following year, 1848, was very lucky not to be charged with murder. Again, I don't know how much history any of you know, but the significance of 1848 is that it was a year of rebellion. You know the magic dates in Irish history in terms of rebellion: 1916, 1867, 1848, 1803, 1798. All of those years there were rebellions. So 1848 there was a rebellion. So the army that was stationed here was very on edge. There was no military barracks in Tipperary at that time. The military barracks wasn't built until the 1870s. This is the 1840s. So when they sent troops into the area, which was very disturbed because you had lots of stuff going on, where did they station or billet the troops? Here in the Abbey. They sent by that time there was a boarding school, and they sent the boys home. So the troops were here. And this priest that I'm talking about, the last of the Augustinians, was here, was minding his own business at the bottom of the hill, Bridge Street Hill, just about to cross the bridge, when he was abused by some soldiers who were on their way back to the barracks, which was here in the school. And they were on their way back from the pubs, so they had a lot of drinks, so they were, and because of this rebellion going on, you can imagine the abuse that they were shouting at the priest. So some of the local people said, well, this isn't good enough, so they kind of came to the priest's aid, and there was a riot. And while the soldiers had guns, fortunately they didn't use them. The local people had access to stones, which was the normal weapon that was used, sticks or stones. You know the nickname for Tipperary people, yes? You know the way some counties have nicknames for their people, Kenny Cats. You've heard of that? So what are Tipperary? They're stone throwers. Did you not ever hear that? Well, they were stone throwers, and that was their nickname for good reason. So stones were thrown. One of the British soldiers was killed. Stoned. That was the end of him. So there was an investigation, and of course there was an arrest. So they couldn't find out who was actually responsible. So the priest who was in at the beginning of this riot was arrested and presumably would have stood charged, would have stood trial for murder, but whether you'd say fortunately or unfortunately, he died before the case could come to trial. And so that was the kind of a very odd example of the very last of the Augustinians who was here, the first of whom, and that's 1848, and the first of whom had come here in 1300. So that's the story of the Augustinians here, which is just that first part of what was going on this site. How you'd incorporate that in your mural, I don't know, because it's only one tiny part of a much larger story. As I say, the Ryans had access, because when this was a religious house, when the friars, the people who were here were not monks, they were friars. No matter what the distinction is, but when they were here, they had some land surrounding the town. Because obviously they had to have an income, so they would have farmed the land and sold the crops, and that would have been their income. So there was a certain amount of land, and so as I said, the Ryans had